We all have a mental image of Mark Twain as an old man in a white suit, smoking a cigar and looking wise. In his early years that I'm writing about, he was still a red-headed wise guy, sort of a real-life Tom Sawyer who was always getting into trouble and then talking or walking his way out of it. He was always on the verge of lighting out for somewhere else, and before he permanently stopped lighting out in April of 1910, he had visited 5 continents, gone around the world twice, personally crossed the Atlantic Ocean 29 times, and lived abroad for 14 years. Travel, he said, was liberalizing. Whenever you write a book, the first thing people want to know is why. I always hope they mean, why did you write this particular book, not why did you write this particular book. In the case of Mark Twain, he really combines 2 of my major interests, which are Civil War history and American literature. Ernest Hemingway, who was never particularly generous when talking about other writers, liked to say that all American literature comes from one book by Mark Twain called The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. It's the best book we've had. Critics sometimes debate the second part of Hemingway's equation, but he was absolutely right about the first part, I think. Mark Twain was really the first American writer to write in the way that Americans really speak, which is free and easy, and you can hear his famous Missouri accent in everything he wrote. Before Mark Twain came along, American writers were really dominated, American literature was dominated by writers living in New England, such as Ralph Waldo Emerson and John Greenleaf Whittier, who really wrote and sounded like aristocratic Englishmen. And Twain sounded like nobody but himself, and a seemingly easy but actually very difficult thing to do. He was also the first writer of prominence to come from the American frontier. He of course grew up in Hannibal, Missouri, and his time when he spent out in the Wild West, which is sort of the subject of my book, was really the thing that really made him a truly transcontinental figure. As a boy in Hannibal, he said everybody wanted to grow up to be a Mississippi riverboat pilot. So he actually went to New Orleans, and the only way you could become a pilot was to get a real pilot to train you. And so he hired an older pilot named Horace Bigsby and paid him $500, which he borrowed from his brother-in-law, to teach him about the Mississippi River. The first lesson didn't go very well. Bigsby was carefully explaining all the sandbars and the various trouble spots and where to dock the boat. And he noticed that Mark Twain wasn't taking any notes. Twain said he thought he was just making conversation. Bigsby said, "Taking you by and large, you seem like more different kinds of an ass than anybody I've ever met." But Twain stuck with it and got his pilot's license in 1859, an achievement that he always considered the proudest moment of his life. He said he fully expected to follow the river the rest of my days and die at the wheel when my mission was ended, but then, as Abraham Lincoln would say a few years later, the war came, and everything changed overnight for Mark Twain and the rest of the country. The Mississippi closed down for commercial travel for the duration of the war, and Twain was deathly afraid that he'd be drafted into the Union Navy or the Confederate Navy, depending on who controlled that part of the river, and as he said, become a target for every Tom, Dick, and Harry on shore. So he left New Orleans and he went to St. Louis, where his sister Pamela lived, and spent several weeks hiding out. He was convinced that the entire Union Confederate Navy was searching for him and that he would be dragged off to serve on the ship. But after a few weeks of hiding, he went home to Hannibal to collect a debt that one of his friends owed him. And the friends talked him into joining a group of Confederate cavalry that they were forming called the Marion Rangers. 25 years later, Twain wrote about his brief and rather inglorious Civil War career in an article entitled "The Private History of a Campaign That Failed." The dramatic climax of the article was what Twain described as the tragic killing of an innocent civilian by the Rangers one night. He said that this shooting had really soured him on the war, and he found that he wasn't really equipped for this awful business. That much was true, but the killing itself was totally made up. The Marion Rangers never killed anybody in their brief existence, either accidentally or on purpose, not even each other. But it gave Mark Twain a convenient excuse to retire from the Confederate Army. This was probably for the best. If he had stayed on, he might well have gotten himself killed. The Civil War was particularly nasty in Missouri when you had such stone-cold killers as Jesse James and Cole Younger and Bloody Bill Anderson and William Clark Quantrill riding around the countryside shooting anybody that got in their way, and they were on Twain's side. Still, he said later that he might have made a pretty good soldier if he had stayed in the Army because he already knew more about retreating than the man that invented retreating. He went back to St. Louis and was hiding out at his sister's house again, wondering, as was often the case with Twain, what he was going to do next. And his brother Orion arrived with the surprising news that he had been appointed secretary to the governor of Nevada Territory. He even had an official-looking piece of paper signed by Abraham Lincoln to prove it. And being Orion, that was all he had. Like the rest of the Clemens family, he was dead broke, and Mark Twain gladly offered to pay both their ways out west if Orion would just let him go along. So on July 25th, 1861, the two brothers lit out for the territory from St. Joseph, Missouri, aboard a one-ton Concord stagecoach drawn by 6 horses and cushioned by leather shock absorbers that Twain said made the ride feel like a cradle on wheels. Actually, his first day as a reporter, he was wandering around wondering what to report on, and he came upon a gunfight in a saloon, and according to him, of course, it's hard to tell fact from fiction with Mark Twain. One of the gunslingers shot the other one and shot and killed him, and Twain rushed up and shook his hand and said, "Oh, thank you, you really made my day, and if there's anything I can do for you, don't hesitate to ask, and now if you could manage to get yourself hanged, it would really make the day perfect." The newspaper staff met every night at a saloon across the street called the Bucket of Blood, where they drank copious amounts of the local home brew, which was known as 40 Rod. Twain said it got its name because that was the approximate distance a tenderfoot could stagger before collapsing in a heap after drinking it. His habit of creative reporting finally got him into trouble one day when the editor of the rival Virginia City Union challenged him to a duel because Twain had reported that the Union newspaper wasn't supporting the Union cause vociferously enough. Twain, of course, had been a Confederate himself, but that didn't really seem to matter, except to the editor of the Virginia City Union, who insisted on fighting a duel. But Twain, as usual, preferred to avoid any kind of physical confrontation. He said he didn't have time to fight a duel just then, and besides, he had been drunk when he wrote the story in the first place. The editor persisted in challenging him, so Twain decided that the better part of valor was just to leave Virginia City. And so he moved to San Francisco in 1864, took a job on a newspaper there called the San Francisco Morning Call. The problem was that the editor of the San Francisco Call actually expected him to do some real work, and Twain said that was awful slavery for a lazy man. And there he heard apparently a favorite local story about a champion jumping frog that was filled with buckshot one day to trick a gambler and win a bet. And so Twain said, if I could write the story just the way it was told to me, that frog would jump all around the world. And it turned out he was right. His story, the celebrated jumping frog of Calaveras County, caught on all across the country and was picked up in newspapers throughout the East. And so Mark Twain, actually like Lord Byron, he woke up one morning and found himself famous.